December 2025. Somewhere within the icy Arctic seas above Russia, a two-decade-old petroleum tanker, corroding and scarcely seaworthy, pushes through frozen sheets it wasn't engineered to traverse. Its monitoring system stays silent. Its coverage documents are fraudulent. Its proprietorship is concealed beneath multiple shell corporations across 3 continents. And it's transporting 150,000 tons of Russian petroleum worth millions, evading every restriction the Western nations have imposed on Moscow. This isn't a singular event. This isn't an aberration. This is occurring right now at this precise moment with 100 ships doing precisely the same thing, converting Russia's Arctic shoreline into the planet's most lucrative contraband route. And the European Union, despite investing billions in restrictions, despite blacklisting nearly 600 ships, despite 3 years of financial combat, is observing powerlessly as Putin's Phantom Armada makes a farce of everything they've constructed. Let me transport you back to February 2022. Russia invades Ukraine, and the Western nations respond with what they term the most extensive restrictions framework in contemporary history. Petroleum price limitations, technology prohibitions, monetary restrictions, property seizures. The European Union prohibits Russian petroleum imports completely. The United States warns any ship, any corporation, any nation that assists Moscow in selling its petroleum above $60 per barrel. On documentation, it's catastrophic. Russia's finances should crumble. Putin's conflict apparatus should exhaust its funding. Except that's not what transpired, not even remotely. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Russia didn't merely endure these restrictions. They adjusted, they transformed, and they constructed something the West never foresaw. A Phantom Armada so enormous, so advanced, so invulnerable that it now constitutes 18.5% of every petroleum tanker on Earth. Nearly 1,000 ships functioning in darkness, transporting petroleum worth billions monthly, and the number continues expanding. But here's where it becomes genuinely disturbing. In 2024, only 13 of these Phantom vessels attempted to utilize Russia's northern maritime route. The 5,600-kilometer Arctic corridor that slices directly from Russian petroleum terminals to Asian destinations. 13 ships. The route was hazardous, extensively surveilled, and dangerous for Moscow's concealed activities. Then 2025 arrived. That number skyrocketed to 100 vessels. Not a progressive expansion, not a gradual development, an eruption. 100 restricted ships, 1/3 of all movement on that route, converting Russia's Arctic shoreline into what analysts are now designating the Northern Phantom Route, a passage of forbidden petroleum worth potentially hundreds of billions that Europe cannot halt, cannot supervise. It evidently cannot even adequately monitor anymore. The statistics reveal a narrative that should alarm anyone who trusted restrictions would succeed. Russia's Phantom Armada started modestly. After the invasion, Moscow understood restrictions were approaching, so they commenced discreetly acquiring deteriorating tankers, ships nearing the conclusion of their functional existence, vessels that Western corporations were prepared to dismantle. By the conclusion of 2022, Russia managed over 600 ships. By December 2023, that figure reaches somewhere between 1,000 and 2,400 vessels. Today, in January 2026, we're examining nearly 1,000 tankers with a combined capability of 127 million deadweight tons. These aren't modest boats. These are enormous petroleum carriers, Aframaxes, Suezmaxes, even VLCCs, very large petroleum carriers capable of transporting 2 million barrels of petroleum in a singular voyage. And 78% of them are beyond 15 years old, ancient by maritime standards, inadequately maintained, barely covered, ecological catastrophes awaiting occurrence. But they're transporting Russian petroleum, and that's everything that matters to Moscow. Here's what makes the Northern Maritime Route so threatening for Western restrictions. Traditional maritime routes from Russian Baltic terminals to Asia travel through European waters, past Denmark, through international bottlenecks where the European Union can supervise, intercept, and compel ships to conform. It's a lengthy voyage, extensively examined with multiple opportunities for implementation. The Northern Maritime Route transforms everything. It slices directly across the summit of Russia through Arctic waters that Moscow governs, past shorelines where Russian officials determine who gets monitored and who doesn't. Ships utilizing this route bypass European waters completely. They bypass examination, they bypass implementation. And in 2025, Russia made a deliberate determination to cease releasing information about who's utilizing the route. The Northern Maritime Route Administration, which formerly sustained public documentation of every vessel, every voyage, every incident, every safety infraction, terminated their openness systems in October 2025. They closed their public electronic ship movement service. They ceased distributing annual summaries of accidents and incidents. Rosatom, Russia's nuclear enterprise that administers the route, evidently concluded that concealing information was more beneficial than maritime protection. So now, these 100 restricted vessels travel through Arctic waters, and Western intelligence must depend on satellites, sources, and speculation to monitor them. Let me provide you particular illustrations of how audacious this has become. The tanker Myers, a 20-year-old vessel with zero frozen classification, meaning it was never constructed to manage frozen waters, navigated from China through the northern maritime route in September 2025, transporting Russian petroleum. It had no icebreaker accompaniment. The administrators literally anticipated they'd encounter beneficial frozen conditions and simply dispatched it regardless. Maritime analysts termed this grossly irresponsible. The ship could have become imprisoned, could have triggered an ecological catastrophe, could have required emergency assistance in waters where, according to ecological organization Bellona, there's absolutely zero assistance capability to address accidents promptly. But it completed passage, and it transported Russian petroleum that restrictions were intended to prevent. Another vessel, the Lynx, a 14-year-old tanker, also without frozen classification, became imprisoned in frozen sheets days afterward, while transporting 150,000 tons of petroleum from Murmansk to China. It waited days for help, and here's the revelation. The Lynx wasn't even in the official documentation of the NSR administration. No official authorization, no paperwork. It simply materialized transporting restricted petroleum, completely unrecorded. Then there's the LNG dimension of this activity, which might be even more refined. Russia's Arctic LNG-2 initiative, extensively restricted by the United States and European Union, is intended to be disabled. It's intended to be incapable of exporting liquefied natural gas because Western corporations can't supply technology, Western ships can't convey it, and Western purchasers can't acquire it. Except in 2025, Bloomberg verified 12 shipments of LNG from this prohibited Arctic initiative. 12 instances restricted vessels loaded liquefied natural gas and transported it primarily to China. Ships like the Pioneer, which in August 2024 accomplished the first documented ship-to-ship exchange of restricted Russian LNG near Port Said, Egypt. The Pioneer deactivated its automatic identification system, essentially becoming invisible, executed a hazardous exchange activity in international waters to camouflage the cargo's source, then departed. This is the kind of refined circumvention that's becoming standard. In January 25th, satellite imagery verified something even more bold. A concurrent double ship-to-ship exchange at the SCF floating storage facility near Murmansk. One vessel transported LNG from Arctic LNG-2 to floating storage, while another vessel concurrently loaded from that identical storage to convey it to China's Beihai terminal. Two activities, identical location, identical moment, transporting restricted gas that was intended to be impossible to export. Now let's discuss the finances, because that's what this is genuinely about. The European Union and its associates implemented these restrictions to deprive Russia's conflict apparatus of resources, eliminate the petroleum revenues, eliminate the capability to conduct conflict in Ukraine. Simple reasoning. And initially it functioned. Russian petroleum revenues did diminish. The EU calculates revenues decreased by 38 billion since the price limitation was introduced. In March 2025, Russian revenues were 13.7% reduced than March 2023 and 20.3% reduced than March 2022. That sounds effective until you examine the opposite dimension of the calculation. According to the Kiev School of Economics, the Phantom Armada permitted Russia to successfully circumvent the price limitation mechanism and produce about $9.4 billion in supplementary revenue in 2024 alone. $9.4 billion that restrictions were engineered to prohibit, and in 2024, despite everything, Moscow's total petroleum revenues actually expanded about 5% from 2023, achieving approximately $16.4 billion. Let me reiterate that. Restrictions escalated, more ships were blacklisted, implementation increased, and Russian petroleum revenues ascended. August 2025 demonstrated precisely how this functions in application. Russia's petroleum export revenues that month reached $13.5 billion. 155 Phantom Armada tankers departed Russian terminals, many participating in ship-to-ship exchanges to camouflage cargo sources. Only 21% of petroleum and 82% of petroleum products were conveyed utilizing tankers protected by international group coverage. The legitimate traceable coverage that confirms conformity. The remainder, the vast majority of petroleum shipments, traveled on Phantom Armada vessels with unknown insurers, fraudulent certificates, or no genuine coverage whatsoever. India imported 1.5 million barrels daily of Russian seaborne petroleum in August, 45% of Russia's total seaborne petroleum exports. Turkey acquired 425,000 barrels daily of petroleum products. China remained a substantial purchaser through its eastern terminals. The petroleum continued flowing, the finances continued arriving, and restrictions continued failing to prevent it. The European Union has attempted to counter. They genuinely have. In May 2025, they introduced their 17th restrictions package, the largest ever targeting the Phantom Armada, adding 189 vessels in a singular action and multiplying their blacklist. In December 2025, they added 41 more ships, bringing the aggregate to almost 600 restricted vessels. They restricted 5 individuals and 4 organizations supporting the Phantom Armada Value Network, targeting petroleum merchants like Morteza Lakhani, a Pakistani-Canadian facilitator who purportedly assisted Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin establish networks to maintain Russian petroleum flowing internationally. They restricted maritime corporations in the United Arab Emirates, Vietnam, and Russia itself. The EU's High Representative Kaja Kallas announced they would now restrict Phantom Armada vessels on a continuous monthly foundation, adding ships continuously rather than awaiting comprehensive packages. They adopted statements about utilizing international maritime law to confront Phantom Armada hazards. They prohibited these vessels from EU terminals. They banned European corporations from supplying maritime services. On documentation, it appears forceful and comprehensive. But here's the harsh reality that the information discloses. Restrictions are only as powerful as implementation, and implementation is deteriorating. Research from Brookings Institution in May 2025 discovered that large-scale tanker restrictions diminished Russia's Phantom Armada capability by 46%, which sounds remarkable until you examine what transpired subsequently. The quantity of restricted vessels that simply disregarded their designation and continued loading Russian petroleum regardless grew from 44 ships in January 2025 to 143 ships by November 2025. That's not a progressive expansion. That's rebellion. 75 ships by May, 107 by August, then 143 in November, including a 28-ship surge in a singular month. These vessels are intended to be eliminated from commercial operation. They're intended to be incapable of functioning. Instead, they're loading Russian petroleum, navigating to Asia, transporting their cargo, and returning for more. 621 vessels had been designated as restricted by December 2025 across different authorities. The Phantom Armada counter was to add more ships to compensate and to simply disregard the designations. The effectiveness of restrictions varies dramatically depending on who distributes them, and this is generating substantial loopholes. Analysis from Kepler, a maritime information corporation, discovered that vessels restricted by the United States Office of Foreign Assets Control experience an average productivity reduction of 70%. These ships genuinely struggle to function. But vessels restricted exclusively by the European Union or United Kingdom observe only a 30% diminution in productivity. Why the difference? Because Russia's commercial associates, particularly China and India, are more reluctant to challenge American institutions due to vulnerability to the US dollar for commerce and financing. They're far less troubled about angering Brussels, so EU restrictions become recommendations rather than absolute obstacles. Ships blacklisted by Europe can still locate purchasers, still acquire coverage from Russian or offshore suppliers, still execute exchanges in international waters, and still transport petroleum to terminals in India and Turkey that are prepared to disregard. The coverage situation alone demonstrates how profoundly fractured the mechanism is. Western nations require maritime coverage that satisfies minimum standards, including confirmation of ship condition and legitimate protection in case of accidents. The Phantom Armada functions almost completely outside the mechanism. 2/3 of ships transporting Russian petroleum have unknown insurers. When investigators examine these vessels, they repeatedly discover falsified or terminated coverage certificates. Ships claim protection from Russian suppliers like Ingostrak or from questionable offshore corporations that may not possess the resources to address a major petroleum discharge. The post-restrictions expansion of this armada has noticeably increased the quantity of vessels deficient in adequate international coverage, generating what analysts describe as a pending ecological time explosive. In January 2024, the 18-year-old restricted tanker Koroyev had an anchor malfunction and became immobilized in the Bosphorus, terminating all movement through one of the planet's most critical maritime bottlenecks. In March 2024, the Andromeda Star, a tanker possessed by a Seychelles-based corporation without adequate coverage, collided with another vessel off Denmark's shoreline. An ecological catastrophe was narrowly prevented only because the tanker was returning vacant to Russia, rather than transporting 700,000 barrels of petroleum. In February 2025, detonations impacted the tanker Kavala in Russia's Ust-Luga terminal, while it was transporting 130,000 tons of fuel. The crew evacuated. Russian officials claimed no fuel discharged, and the tanker wasn't at hazard of submerging. But incidents involving Phantom Armada tankers are becoming more regular, and each one carries catastrophic potential. slowly deteriorating, generating functional hazards and obstacles that will intensify over duration. The northern maritime route itself confronts similar difficulties. Total cargo movement on the route was 36.2 million tons in 2025, down 1.7 million tons from 2024. Putin's original strategy was to amplify Arctic shipments to 80 million tons by 2024. The actual 2025 figure is less than half that objective. The vision of the NSR as a major commercial passage is terminated, replaced by a contraband route that's effective but far from what Moscow imagined. There's also the inquiry of what transpires subsequently, because this is an evolving circumstance, and both dimensions are adjusting. Ukraine has commenced directly attacking Phantom Armada tankers, executing unmanned strikes on vessels in the Black Sea and Mediterranean. In late November 2025, Ukraine's security service attacked tankers Varnet and Chirac off the Turkish Black Sea shoreline, then attacked the EU restricted tanker Deschamps. In December 2025, they performed their first long-distance Mediterranean attack, targeting a tanker that had transported petroleum to India. According to reporting from The Atlantic, the Trump administration didn't oppose to these attacks and supplied assistance, regarding them as significant instruments to compel the Kremlin toward peace discussions. These aren't symbolic demonstrations. These are kinetic activities engineered to make the Phantom Armada more costly and hazardous to function. A Turkish corporation suspended Russian-related activities after its vessel Mersin was damaged. If Ukraine can systematically threaten high-value tankers, if they can generate genuine alarm among crews and administrators, if they can impose expenses that surpass profits, the finances of the Phantom Armada could transform dramatically. The European Union is also investigating more forceful measures beyond simply adding ships to restrictions catalogs. There's deliberation of implementing a complete conveyance prohibition where any tanker that accesses a Russian terminal gets blacklisted regardless of proprietorship, coverage status, or claim conformity. This would eliminate the documentation deception that currently permits some vessels to appear compliant while actually conveying Russian petroleum above the price limitation. Since a substantial portion of Russian petroleum exports travels through European waters and bottlenecks like the Danish channels, the EU could theoretically identify and prohibit these tankers with much greater effectiveness. The obstacle is political determination and the hazard of elevating global petroleum prices if implementation is too forceful. But the policy is being seriously contemplated, and it would fundamentally transform the calculation for anyone functioning in Russian petroleum commerce. Individual European nations are also taking measures. In January 2026, Germany intervened when the Cameroon-designated Russian Phantom Armada tanker Eventon approached on its route to St. Petersburg, compelling it to reverse direction and exit the Baltic Sea. This indicated a potential transformation in Baltic nations' willingness to actively obstruct Phantom Armada vessels rather than simply restricting them on documentation. In April 2025, the Estonian Navy seized a flagless tanker, the Kerala, in the Baltic Sea that was pretending to be registered in Djibouti. The vessel was restricted by both the EU and UK and was heading to load petroleum in Ust-Luga. Estonia detained the ship for over 2 weeks before releasing it, transmitting a message that physical interdiction is feasible. These are modest measures, individual cases, but they suggest a growing appetite for more direct implementation that does not simply depend on documentation and terminal prohibitions. The coverage angle also offers potential influence. If Western nations and their associates can compel the international group of P&I clubs and major insurers to more forcefully confirm protection and decline to engage with any vessel that has contacted Russian terminals, it could constrict the Phantom Armada functional capability. Right now, only 21% of Russian petroleum shipments utilize legitimate international group coverage. If that number decreased further, if ships genuinely couldn't acquire protection that terminals would accept, if the separation between legitimate maritime and phantom maritime became so extensive that mainstream administrators refused any contact with vessels that might have Russian connections, the isolation would damage. Russia would still possess its own coverage suppliers and offshore corporations, but they couldn't address the scale of activities required, and the hazard vulnerability would ascend. There's also the long-duration inquiry of whether China and India will continue to supply such willing destinations for Russian petroleum transported by increasingly hazardous Phantom Armada vessels. Both nations benefit enormously from discounted Russian petroleum. India is acquiring 45% of Russia's seaborne petroleum exports at prices well beneath market rates. China is importing substantial volumes through its eastern terminals. They're not going to suddenly cease out of moral concern or Western compulsion. But if the ecological hazards become too substantial, if a major tanker catastrophe transpires in waters near their shorelines, if the diplomatic expenses of being observed as enablers of restriction circumvention surpass the financial benefits, their calculations could transform. Beijing and New Delhi are pragmatic participants. They'll support Moscow as long as it serves their interests. The moment it doesn't, they'll modify. And Russia comprehends this, which is why they are so forceful about sustaining the illusion that the Phantom Armada is professional and operational, even as they dispatch deteriorating, uninsured tankers through Arctic frozen sheets. So where does this all lead? The title inquires whether Putin's new route will destroy EU restrictions permanently. The honest response is not destroy, but seriously compromise. The Northern Maritime Route and the broader Phantom Armada activity have proven that determined restrictions, circumvention backed by state resources and willing purchasers, can significantly diminish financial combat. Russia has discovered methods to maintain petroleum revenues flowing that the West cannot completely halt without risking military confrontation or global energy market disorder. The 100 vessels utilizing the NSR in 2025, compared to 13 in 2024, demonstrates how rapidly Moscow can scale up circumvention infrastructure when they identify vulnerabilities. The fact that 621 restricted vessels exist, and 143 of them simply continued loading Russian petroleum regardless in November 2025, demonstrates that blacklists alone didn't function. The reality that Russia's petroleum revenues in 2024 actually expanded 5%, despite escalating restrictions, demonstrates that the financial compulsion is not achieving its primary objective of depriving the conflict apparatus. But permanently is a lengthy duration. This is a dynamic circumstance. Russia is succeeding currently, but they're also confronting mounting expenses, infrastructure deterioration, increased implementation measures, and the constant threat that Western nations will discover new compulsion points. The Phantom Armada is enormous, but vulnerable. Those deteriorating tankers will malfunction more regularly. Coverage deception will eventually confront administrators. Physical interdiction by nations like Estonia and Germany could expand. Ukrainian attacks could make the finances unsustainable. China and India could diminish acquisitions if diplomatic compulsion escalates. The Arctic itself is merciless, and every winter brings new hazards that inexperienced vessels might not endure. Moscow is winning battles in this financial conflict, but they haven't won the conflict itself. What's absolutely evident is that the current restrictions framework has implemented is not sufficient. Adding ships to catalogs, distributing terminal prohibitions, restricting enablers, these are necessary steps, but insufficient on their own. The European Union and its associates need implementation mechanisms with strength, physical interdiction capabilities, forceful secondary restrictions on nations and corporations that facilitate the commerce, and the political determination to accept short-duration financial pain for long-duration strategic gains. They need to terminate the coverage loopholes, suppress on flags of convenience that permit phantom ships to function with impunity, invest in satellite surveillance and intelligence gathering to monitor dark vessels, and potentially implement complete conveyance prohibitions that don't depend on documentation conformity. Most significantly, they need to accept that restrictions alone cannot conclude Russia's petroleum revenues completely, but can diminish them, complicate them, and make them more costly, which over duration degrades Moscow's capability to sustain military activities in Ukraine. The Northern Maritime Route is Russia's most audacious restriction circumvention passage, a 5,600-kilometer Arctic corridor where 100 restricted vessels now function with decreasing supervision and increasing ecological hazard. It represents everything incorrect with the current implementation framework and everything threatening about a planet where financial regulations can be disregarded by determined state participants with enough resources and cynicism. But it's not game concluded. It's not an invincible trap. It's a challenge that requires Western nations to be as adaptive, as forceful, and as prepared to take hazards as Moscow has been. The inquiry isn't whether Putin discovered a route around restrictions. He did. The inquiry is whether Europe and its associates possess the determination to terminate that route before it becomes permanent, before more ships join the Armada, before the Arctic becomes a lawless passage that compromises the entire concept of international restrictions. And that response in January 2026 remains very much undetermined.